So anyway, let's get started. We're so thankful. Our first session today, the Santa Ana and Los Angeles rivers, a closer look at our past to prepare wisely for the future. Western Water once stated that travel most anywhere in California and there is a river, a creek, or a stream nearby. Some are highly noticeable and are an integral part of the community. Others are more obscure, with intermittent flows or enclosed by box concrete flood channels that conceal their true appearance. No matter the location, each area shares some common themes: cooperation and conflict regarding water allocations, greater water conservation, and awareness of environmental stewardship, and plans to ensure long-term sustainability. Those are the key issues. Both the Santa Ana and Los Angeles rivers were lifelines that shaped communities and the economy of Southern California. They share many traits. How can we continue to harness their power while also bringing them back to life? Key questions. In our first session titled The Santa Ana and Los Angeles Rivers, a closer look at our past to prepare wisely for the future, we're going to hear from two speakers. To allow our speakers enough time to present for the audience and for the audience to ask questions, I'm going to be brief with the intros. Again, the speakers' bios are in print. Phil Brigandi has been researching and writing local history since 1975 and has published more than 24 books on the history of Orange, Riverside, and San Diego counties. He has served as Orange County Archivist, and Michael Holland is Archivist for the City of Los Angeles. Please join me in welcoming Phil and Michael to the stage. How are you, sir?
Good morning.
To see you. There we go. Nice to see you, my friend. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to start with Phil. Phil, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, all. I've just been given the little task of giving you a brief overview of, about 300 years of the history of the Santa Ana River in 12 minutes. So hang on. I suppose we should start with one of my favorite subjects, the name. The Santa Ana River has gone by a number of different names. The Indians here in Orange County called it Wanawat. When the Spanish first came, 1769, and camped along the curve of the river at the mouth of the Santa Ana Canyon, they experienced an earthquake. So it became the Rio de los Temblores, the Earthquake River. That name was replaced, though, by a name the soldiers took to calling it. The Spanish soldiers called the river Santa Ana, and they very soon had explored much of its length and began to know more about this river. When Anza's expedition came through in 1774, they reached the Santa Ana River up in Riverside, but they knew this was the Santa Ana River and it drained out to the ocean. So we know the Spanish had been exploring the river from the very earliest days. In fact, the Santa Ana River at Olive, here at the mouth of the Santa Ana Canyon, was originally proposed as a mission site, but was moved up to San Gabriel not because of a lack of water, but because of a lack of timber and stone and building materials. The river, in that way, always has influenced settlement patterns. Even in the Indian times, you saw major Indian villages along the Santa Ana River, Hutukna in the Santa Ana Canyon, Tothabit further down in the Orange area. The Spanish and Mexican ranchos were often placed in relationship to the Santa Ana River. The Yorbas at Olive and in the Santa Ana Canyon, Isaac Williams at Chino, the Lugos in San Bernardino. The Yorbas, in fact, did a great deal of irrigation off the Santa Ana River and even ran a water-powered flour mill off the Santa Ana River, as American settlers would in later years. But of course, by settling near the river, flooding was also an issue. In fact, the Yorbas originally appear to have settled down on the flats at the mouth of the Santa Ana Canyon, but after a major flood in 1825, moved up onto the hill about where Olive Elementary School is today. In fact, that flood in 1825 was so large that it shifted the mouth of the Santa Ana River, which had moved a number of times over the centuries. In fact, continued to move until 1921, when the Bitter Point Dam finally forced it out of Newport Bay and directly out to sea. American communities in the latter part of the 19th century were also established in reference to the river. Anaheim, founded in 1857 as an agricultural colony, was actually laid out not on a north-south axis, but in relationship to the ditch from the Santa Ana River, the irrigation ditch. This is why if you look at a map, old downtown Anaheim is tilted, because it follows the flow of water across the land. Riverside was founded to take advantage of water from the Santa Ana River. Orange, my hometown, in 1871, was founded to take advantage of water from the river. Initially, the developers had a private water company that developed an irrigation system. But when this proved unsatisfactory to local farmers, they bought out the company and formed their own joint stock company, the Santa Ana Valley Irrigation Company, which also provided water to parts of Santa Ana and Tustin. These cooperative, mutual, joint stock water companies that develop become the model not just for how we develop water in Southern California, but how the citrus industry develops by using these cooperative measures that everyone can share in. Now, soon after all these new towns were founded, in the late 1870s, we went through a drought period here. And this suddenly put pressure between the north and south sides of the river in Anaheim, Orange, Santa Ana, and also additional water being taken out up in the Riverside and San Bernardino area. And this pressure finally came to a boiling point in about 1877. These were the days when armed men patrolled the irrigation ditches and quick diversion dams went up or were torn down overnight. The whole thing finally ended up in court, where Anaheim ultimately lost because they had only secured the right-of-way for a ditch from the Yorbas, not the water rights. This is actually an important case for establishing riparian rights as an important doctrine in California law. Because the importance of the issue, though, the courts recommended that the two sides compromise, and they did agree on a 50-50 split at Bedrock Canyon in the Santa Ana Canyon that became the basis for the water use here in Orange County for decades to come. Meanwhile, downstream in Orange County, they had the opposite problem. The area below Santa Ana, especially between the two mesas at Huntington Beach and Costa Mesa, was a jungle of willows and marshes and wetlands. Even the ownership of the area was in dispute. You see, the old Mexican ranchos had used the Santa Ana River as a boundary line between two ranchos. So when the river shifted in 1825, did the boundary shift with it? The courts finally ruled no, but before that had happened, a great many people had come in unsettled on what they hoped would be public land between the two ranchos. Instead, they found themselves deemed squatters and had to either move on or buy land out of the rancho. But the problem was, this area was so wet that farming there was difficult. So in the 1890s, the residents began forming cooperative drainage districts, special districts. So while their upstream neighbors are spending time and trouble and money and effort to bring water through elaborate irrigation systems to their farms, the farmers in the swamplands down below are spending time and trouble and money and effort to build drainage ditches to carry the water off to sea, to get rid of the excess water for what would become some of the richest row crop farming land in Orange County. Meanwhile, the upstream farmers with irrigation systems in place were shifting over to oranges. Summer Valencias in Orange County, winter ripening navel oranges in Riverside County. Of course, there were several major floods during this time. 1862 and 1884 were especially bad years. But the population was still sparse here then, and so damage was minimal in all but a few places. But in the 20th century, as the population grew and the farming areas grew, flooding became a real issue. Floods not only damaged homes and business buildings and bridges, they also buried orchards and fields in silt that had to be cleared away. 1916, 1938 were famous flood years with much loss of life and property. The Orange County Flood Control District was therefore established in 1927 and began the work of trying to control the river, though they did have some issues passing their early bond acts to pay for some of these programs. Thus, it was shared with other agencies, Army Corps of Engineers and such. This is the project that gave us Prado Dam, as well as dams on many of the smaller tributaries of the Santa Ana River. Even so, floods continue to be an issue. As we saw in 1969, even with all this in place, we still had major flooding, fatalities, and damage. Though that flood, to be fair, was centered mostly on the Santiago Creek and its tributaries. Beginning in the 1930s, Orange County, like much of Southern California, was forced more and more to rely on imported water, and the importance of the Santa Ana River as a source of irrigation water diminished. The old irrigation companies eventually shut down. The SAVI turned off the pipes in 1974. But the importance of the river in other ways remained. For example, as was mentioned, replenishing the groundwater sources. In the 1930s, the Orange County Water District also began work to protect the local aquifer from saltwater intrusion, showing a lot of foresight there, as some other coastal communities in Orange County have learned, which did not move in that direction. Thus, the Santa Ana River continues to play an important role in the water history of 3 counties. Thank you.
Excellent, Phil. Fantastic, so interesting. Let me ask you one question before we bring up Michael. What are some of the physical things that helped with saltwater intrusion into the groundwater?
Well, essentially, as many of the people here will be familiar, there is a water curtain, a line of wells that injects water in. As I often explain it to the laity, it's like a sponge. And the ground is going to want to soak in this water, whether seawater or fresh. The problem is, once you get the seawater in, it's not coming out. So by creating this water curtain, these wells, these injection wells, we're able to hold back as we draw from the aquifer to keep the seawater out.
So the technology hasn't changed since the late 1800s for this?
It's really grown more sophisticated, but the principle is the same.
Really, it's a fascinating discussion. Michael, look forward to hearing from you.
All right, thank you. I'll use the podium over here.
Thank you. All right. The big green button, right? Thank you. Good morning, everybody. All right, there's the first slide. There are many ways to start a story. This is one of them. 4 of the most magical words ever written or spoken. And here's another. There it is. Take it. 5 words that opened up an era of mythology for Los Angeles and its water, and closed off what had preceded it as part of a romantic past of haciendas and missions. That was 1913. 60-plus years later, 6 words were likewise spoken that changed all that had come before in the world of film before them, and still affects us today. Oh, come on, with all the attention down here this weekend, the second coming would probably have less time on the local newscast than the weather. Sorry, Fritz.
You're right.
Okay. Actually, William Mulholland said a lot more that particular day in November 1913 at the opening of the aqueduct. He had been defending the project in court and before various audiences from the very beginning. The idea of just taking the water really didn't exist until he uttered it. The rest of the story, from the founding of the city of Los Angeles in 1781 until that Wednesday afternoon, revolved around the reality that the water from the Los Angeles River wasn't taken as much as it was wrestled away, and it put up a fight, and it imposed rules on his would-be masters in the past that may seem all too familiar today. Let me show you a few historical items from the Los Angeles City Archives. Let's take a look at the LA water policies of the 19th century from the 1830s to approximately 1896. Many of the documents that you'll see were translated from the original Spanish documents in the 1870s. There were two issues that brought the citizens of the Pueblo to their atamiento, or common council, more than anything else. One was access to land, which was basically given away to citizens. Now, two was that later those same citizens would return to request the water to improve it. Only citizens of Spain and later Mexico could apply for land. You became a citizen by swearing allegiance to the crown, converting to Catholicism, and learning to speak Spanish. Only then could you become a landowner and marry into the local families. Here are several words that show up in the Los Angeles archival documents you'll want to remember. Zanja is Spanish for water ditch. Zanja Madre is the mother ditch. And the Zanjero is the overseer of the Zanja system. Even after the Americans came in, these terms continued to be used until at least the 1920s. During this period before 1850, everyone had a shared responsibility for caring for the Zanjas. If you were a landowner, you were obligated to provide labor from your operation to assist the Zanjero. This is a notice instructing all owners of farming lands on the attached list to send laborers and their tools to do repairs on the canals and the river dam. There's a special caution against sending, quote, boys unable to do a man's work, or nor to admit any laborers with tools that cannot be used. This is the list, or here's a sample list of the landowners and their labor contributions to the Zanjero, plus chipping in towards his salary. Look at the box on the left. Louis Vigny, Jean-Louis Vigny, pays 4 reals, or 50 cents, a month towards the salary of the Zanjero, plus providing 4 laborers from his vineyard operation when needed. Vignes was one of the wealthier dons during the Mexican period, having arrived from Bordeaux, France in 1829. The box on the right is from the 1850 Los Angeles County Census, showing his property valued at approximately $50,000 in that current valuation. His El Aliso vineyard property fronted the Los Angeles River near where Union Station is today. The role of the Zanjero and the access to water changed after the Americans came in 1850. What had been in the past a communal asset was now a commodity and available for private business investment. Just as in the Spanish and the Mexican eras, the American city of Los Angeles adopted to the new regime and still kept some of their earlier practices. The American way of doing things, however, was impossible to miss. In 1860, the rules still required the use of conscripted labor from the landowners, as you see here, 1 laborer per 15 acres under cultivation. When was the irrigation season in Los Angeles? According to the 1860 regulations, the season ran from March 1st to September 30th. Many of the early regulations specified nighttime watering beginning an hour before sunset. Now, there were several attempts in the 1850s to supply water in pipes, first made from redwood and then iron, but none of those were successful because they were always undercapitalized and they were not, in fact, designed by hydrologists. Damien Marichal former city mayor and also an investor, became so despondent after the failure of his water company that he took his own life in the city council chambers in January 1868. By the end of that year, however, the city had a privately funded Los Angeles Water Company, and it had a 30-year lease to provide water to most of the city of Los Angeles. The Zaniero was the highest paid government employee, made more money than the mayor. This voucher for $100 was paid to the former mayor, Cristobal Aguilar, in 1877, which was a pay raise over his salary of 1872 when he was mayor. By comparison, the mayor was paid $1,000 per year, council members were each paid $800 per year, and the chief of police was $500 a year plus a percentage of fines collected. Yeah, we won't go down that rabbit hole. Now, the regulations continued to expand as the city grew. By the 1860s, Los Angeles was starting to use gaslight and was starting to construct an enclosed sewer system. By 1875, the first railroad connection appeared, and just like the railroad of that time or today's cable companies, the Los Angeles Water Company came to represent everything that was wrong with capitalism. By the 1870s, water meters were starting to appear, along with fixture charges. If you look at this slide, you can see that they were charging literally for the number of fixtures in your home. So $1 for each bathtub, $1 for a private water closet. How many of these do you have at home? Okay. And keeping in mind that that was only for access. Water itself was an additional charge. So this is just an access fee for getting access to your home or your business. And the supply pipes and the taps, they were installed by the water company and they remained their property. Does anyone remember back in the days when AT&T owned the phones that you had in your homes? Yeah. Now, there were very few regulations where monopolies were concerned. I mean, this was, to quote Mark Twain, the Gilded Age. We have here $1.50 for 12 hours of water during the day, $1 for 12 hours overnight, 25 cents per single hour paid in advance. Wrap your brains around that idea. Now, by 1888, most of the land that had been orchards and vineyards were gone. This page from the mayor's annual report to the city council shows a new set of priorities: cleanliness of the water, and then also fostering the ridiculous belief that they actually had enough water for 1 million people. Now, the parkland that Griffith J. Griffith donated to the city in 1896 was unlike any other. All of the city parks were controlled, manicured, and domesticated. Griffith Park was wild, untamed, and originally not bordering the city. It wouldn't until 1910 that the park actually became part of the city boundary. But beyond the land itself, there was something else that the city wanted and got, and it's underlined on that page. Quote, 5 miles of the Los Angeles River bottom. Now the city had a potential alternative to the Los Angeles Water Company, with time running out on that 30-year lease. But the Los Angeles Water Company was behaving badly, surprise, surprise. Once the city had decided not to renew the lease in 1898, the company refused to sell the existing system for a reasonable sum, insisting that it was worth $3 million. An arbitration panel ruled against them, and they still refused to negotiate. The city ended up floating $2 million of municipal bonds and finally took possession of the system in 1902. Now, the direct superintendent of the water company at that time was William Mulholland. And the new board of water commissioners for what eventually became DWP hired him as their chief engineer. But of course, the story doesn't end there, and I think we would all agree that it continues to this day. I hope you've been entertained a little bit and perhaps see yourselves in what the Zanieros were doing. because in a way you are all Zañeros. And I mean that in a good way. So I hope you enjoy your day, and may the force be with you. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Michael. I'll tell you, it's pretty impressive how sophisticated water regulation was in the mid and late 1800s. I mean, I could see using one of their systems during a drought where you charge more depending on what time of the day you take the water. I could see somebody coming up with that idea now.
Oh, yeah.
That was really fascinating. I mean, they knew even at that early time that it was the most valuable resource.
It was literally life or death.
Amazing. All right, well, before we begin the question and answer period, I want to invite another guest to the stage. I'm going to invite Greg Woodside, who is Executive Director of Planning and Natural Resources from the Orange County Water District, to join us for the discussion. OCWD manages a 6-mile stretch of the Santa Ana River. Come on up, Greg. Oh, hi, Greg. He magically appeared out of nowhere, like an increase in water rates. Just kidding. You know, there's a transitional humor. Okay, so Michael, I don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but there was an article recently in the LA Times about how much of a mishmash the regulations were about the various parcels that are owned adjacent to the river. I guess there are 500 parcels that intersect with a river, and a third of those are privately owned, and they're all over the place. They look like abandoned roads, and some go to the middle of the river, and some go bank to bank, and they're all over the place with no regulation. So, and there's not that much known about that or the reasons why that happened. So what can you tell us about that throughout history?
Part of it was, as I alluded to, up until the Americans, water was considered a communal asset. And so it didn't belong to anybody, it belonged to everybody. And under the Spanish Crown, everything, the land, the water, the products, everything belonged specifically to the Spanish Crown. The Mexican government said, well, we'll let you buy property, but you have to have everyone has to have access to the same water. And so they were very strict about that. The Americans and private enterprise came in and they changed that. And so I think as you had more and more players coming in, the rules kept changing, the goalposts kept changing. I mean, you look at a lot of the properties that they're talking about, a lot of them are along the, let's say, the Interstate 5 or the 134 freeway. Well, okay, now you're talking about the Army Corps of Engineers, you're talking about Caltrans, you're talking about, you know, a lot of other players, and there are a lot of moving parts, and because of tax sales, because of, you know, all the sorts of things that happen in governments of all types, you lose track of who owns what. And I know the story you're talking about, and there's that one line that says about, you know, reasons that are lost to history. That's nonsense. A lot of those answers are probably found, in places like mine and other institutions that actually have the documents and actually have, you know, that material to answer some of those questions. But yeah, by and large, a lot of it is going to be, we don't know. And it's nothing new.
So you own the land, you don't own the water rights. That's the constant in the whole thing, right? And the people that own the land have no control over the water rights.
I don't even think it's that clear these days. I mean, how far back does the claim go on whether you have just to the center of the river or you have bank to bank? I don't know. I'm not an expert in that field. I have to kind of guess a little bit, but it's no surprise that it's a mess. It's been a mess, and it's going to be a mess for a while until someone comes along and fixes it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So Phil, the Santa Ana River Water Master recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of the resolution of two major lawsuits that had to do with the upper and lower watersheds and the rights to the surface water and the groundwater in the river. Talk about what times were like before they resolved that, and was there any possibility that we could repeat the problems that were pre-resolution?
Well, as I mentioned, in the 19th century, There were plenty of lawsuits between irrigators, both on either side of the river and in upper and lower basins. In fact, one of the few things that Anaheim and the Santa Ana Valley Irrigation Company agreed on was they had problems with Riverside and San Bernardino. That was recognized as early as the 1870s. And so what had happened is, and Michael somewhat alluded to this as well, as the laws came along and the lawsuits came along, the policy slowly evolved. And it's a functional policy. It wasn't sat down and created all at once. And so where in the 1870s we literally had armed men guarding the ditches, now we have attorneys. And and so, to me, there seems, on the one hand, the struggles over the access to water seem to be a very natural thing because they've always gone on. But this is what makes the 1969 Accord so important, was it laid to rest 100 years of some of these questions. It left some other questions to be answered, but it was a huge step forward versus where they had been for the century prior.
Thank you so much, Greg. We've tamed the rivers through cement encasements and the various man-made configurations. What are the current trends in the Santa Ana River watershed regarding river infrastructure and caretaking? I know in LA there have been some recent illustrations by Frank Gehry. He's been commissioned to sort of futurize and renaturalize the LA portion of the LA River, the downtown LA. So what's going on with the Santa Ana River? Anything similar to that?
So in terms of that type of restoration, there's not a big stakeholder group trying to advocate for that at this point. The main activities going on in the Santa Ana River are a large project to improve the flood risk management, or the flood control. So the Army Corps of Engineers and the local flood control districts are working on a long-term project to improve Prado Dam. So they've raised the embankment and made other improvements to the channel to protect us from flooding. And so that's a big investment that's been made. It's taken longer than originally planned. So the project called the Santa Ana River Main Stem has taken longer than planned for various reasons, but primarily due to a shortfall of funding from Congress. So it's a big effort to try to complete that project in about the next 5 years. So the second activity I would highlight is the stakeholders in the watershed, the water district and other stakeholders in the state have been working to remove a non-native plant from the river. So it's a non-native plant called Arundo donax, kind of looks like bamboo, and it clogs up the river channels and is a really significant impact if we let it spread on flood control, fire, and water supply. So we're working very hard to control Arundo.
You mentioned Prado Dam. There was a recent story that ran in the Times and a couple other print publications last week, as a matter of fact, about the safety rating of Prado Dam. It's been downgraded. The story's headline was, Disneyland, dozens of cities could be flooded by dam failure from a huge storm, engineers warn. Is it safe to be sitting here at Disneyland? And how will the DSAC rating impact Orange County's ability to store water behind the dam?
It's very safe to be here, especially since it's not raining, but, but no, it's perfectly safe. So it's hard to explain about a dam in 30 seconds in terms of how dams work, but the important thing for the safety rating was that it related to some features of the spillway. So as you drive east on the 91 freeway, you see Prado Dam as you approach Corona. So the big embankment you see is to the left as you drive east towards Corona. That's the big embankment. That's what holds the water back. The spillway is the structure to the right. It has the faded bicentennial logo. So in the operation of the dam's protected us from Santa Ana River flooding since it was built in 1941. It's done a great job of controlling floods on the Santa Ana River. We haven't had a damaging flood on the river itself. It's different from the tributaries like Santiago, but on the river itself, we haven't had that damaging flood because of the dam. And it's the embankment that holds the water back. The spillway, the structure to the right, that's what caused the decrease in the rating. And the spillway has never had water flow over it. So the dam's never gotten that full. It's not even come close. It's not even come within 10 feet of the water surface coming even close to the spillway. So the spillway will be replaced and redone as part of the Santa Ana River Main Stem project, but it's not something that would cause us concern about flooding right here. It's an identified need, and it's already been identified that the spillway needs to be replaced. So the real focus, I think, is encouraging Congress to complete the funding of the flood control project, and that would replace the structure, and we'd all be good in that sense. So now in terms of our water conservation, in your video you mentioned the deviation. So the Army Corps stores water for us. That's at much lower elevations, and the Army Corps can release the water they hold for us very quickly, so it doesn't really relate to the spillway issue.
Thank you. All right, we have time for one or two brief questions from the audience before we hear that hideous sound from that TV show. Does anybody have a question? Yes, sir. Well, you fire it up. Here you go, there's your mic.
Oh, thank you. Rick Kirkeniff with South Coast Water District. Thank you, Phil and Michael. Wonderful history lesson. As a precursor to the next session, and because we're under the microscope, have you found any historical issues with water quality, specifically to drinking? I know the seawater intrusion issue has been at the mouth of Santa Ana, but in the history, have you found anywhere you have issues with the drinking water?
Oh, yeah. Buried in the water regulations, going as definitely back in even to the Mexican period in the 1830s, 1840s, they had very strong prohibitions about doing laundry, washing anything in the irrigation canals. The Zaniero and his assistants, their job was, among other things, was to keep the canals clean, and so that meant pulling out the weeds or things that might be growing, taking out dead animals, or whatever else happened to find its way into basically an open ditch, and that was separate from the sewer channels that they were also constructing, and they were also making a very clear distinction. You can't use one for the other, and they had those kinds of problems constantly because there was always someone getting in the way.
And as new technology came along, they had to deal with that. So, for example, mining in the mountains put cyanide and mercury into the tributary streams. That was recognized by the early 1900s as an issue to be dealt with.
Really fascinating, guys. Thank you so much. Give them a round of applause. Greg and Phil and Mike really enjoyed it.